Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Museum Brandhorst. My name is Tonio Kröner, and in the name of Painting 2.0's entire curatorial team, Achim Hochdörfer, Manuela Ammer, and David Joselit, I'd like to welcome you very much to tonight's panel discussion following yesterday's opening of our exhibition Painting 2.0. I again and again like to stress that this exhibition is a big proposal, or if you want to say, many small proposals to start the debate, taking painting and its ambivalent histories as a starting point. Therefore, it makes me all the more happy that you, Michel Cour, Kerstin Stakemeier, and Brandon Joseph followed our invitation to give a first response to the exhibition. Michel Cour is editor-in-chief of Artforum since 2010. She helmed the 50th anniversary issue of the magazine, as well as special issues on collaboration and the recent history of painting. She's the author of numerous publications, including essays on the work of Jeff Koons, Robert Rauschenberg, and Fluxus. She contributes to publications such as October and the Art Bulletin. Michel agreed to give an estimate 10-minute response to the exhibition's chapter of social networks, which you might have seen on the ground floor of the museum. Kerstin Stakemeier is a writer and teacher working as professor of art and theory and mediation at the Academy of Fine Arts in Nuremberg. She worked till this year at the CX Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at the Academy of Fine Arts Munich. She writes for Texte zu Kunst, Springerin May, and Artforum. Together with Avigal Mosch, she published Painting the Implicit Horizon, 2011, and with Susanne Witzgal, Power of Materials, Politics of Materiality, 2014, and Fragile Identities, 2015. Kerstin agreed to respond to the show's top floor section of eccentric figuration. Brandon Joseph is a Frank Gallipoli professor of modern and contemporary art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University and founding editor of the journal Grey Room. Just to name two of his many publications, he's author of a book I like very much, Beyond the Dream Syndicate, Tony Conrad and the Arts After Cage, and Random Order, Robert Rauschenberg and the Neo Avant-Garde, 2003. Brandon Joseph followed our invitation to give a brief reaction to the exhibition's chapter, Gesture and Spectacle. I made a mistake in the beginning. Michel, you're responding on social networks. So, Michel will talk about social networks, Brandon on gesture and spectacle, and Kerstin on... Did I say that? I took the last act of like the whole weekend. So. And last but not least, David, I want to introduce you again. David Joselit is Distinguished Professor in the Art History PhD program at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He has taught at the University of California, Irvine, and Yale University, where he was department chair from 2006 to 2009. David is author of Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, published in 1998, American Art since 1945, published 2003, and Feedback Television Against Democracy, published 2007, and I think an important book for the exhibition, After Art, published 2012. David will be the host of tonight's discussion following like the brief responses. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion between the four of you and hopefully the audience in reaction to your statements and discussion. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guests. Thank you.
So we'll just start right away with Brandon and then move to Kerstin and Michel.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Tonio. Thanks also to Achim, David, and Manuela, all of whom I actually knew before this, quite a ways before this exhibition, and to the Brandhorst Museum for inviting me to this panel. There are at least two reasons, other than the normal reasons, that my comments on this panel are bound to be disappointing. The first is the odd, possibly even ironic, positioning of me as an expert on painting, since most of my writing to date has focused on artists generally understood to have found the medium or category of painting to be insufficient. Robert Rauschenberg, for instance, coined the term combine to signify that his three-dimensional paintings/collages had transformed into something that approached, although it was not quite, sculpture. Andy Warhol, whose earliest photomechanical canvases were initially featured by Art in America in the category of prints rather than paintings, publicly announced his retirement from painting after the Paris exhibition of his flowers to devote his time to film and music. Less publicly, but no less dramatically, Rauschenberg also gave up painting around the same time by having the silkscreens used on the canvases that won him the grand prize at the Venice Biennial burned, to focus on performance, dance, and experiments in art and technology. Klaus Oldenburg moved from painting into objects and performances in the 1960s. We all know about Lee Lozano, who dropped out of the New York art world around 1970. One of the striking features of Painting 2.0, indeed its underlying premise, is to reclaim or proclaim or reflect upon the larger reclamation of such post-painting practices as addressable within the larger discursive framework of painting, or of painting at a sort of second remove. This is most striking, perhaps, at least to me, in the inclusion of Andrea Fraser's performance, May I Help You, as within this larger para-painterly discourse. Something that might be interesting to discuss is there's an interesting dialogue here with Matthias Michalka's exhibition of institution critical practices of the 1990s, currently on at the MUMOC in Vienna, where this exhibition heads next, or at least at some step. Also striking is the inclusion of 1980s era bootlegs of Velvet Underground soundtrack material in the section on the factory, which might be interesting to think about as well. To engage with an expanded field of painting practice is also notable because one of our protagonists, Seth Price, or perhaps his fictional alter ego, Seth Price, recently addressed painting from something of the opposite perspective in his novel, Fuck Seth Price, pointing towards certain limitations, even a type of inertness of painting as juxtaposed with sculpture as a larger, unpoliced, ragged ecosystem, his terms, on the one hand, and meditations on the novel on the other. The second reason that my discussion is likely to be disappointing is that I feel compelled to comment on aspects of the catalog, which the audience hasn't had a chance to read yet. The catalog, which is impressive, opens up a number of important and intriguing observations. For instance, about how the recent obsolescence of the material substrates of film and video may have opened up a complementary rather than antagonistic alliance with painting. Or how Duchamp's Tomb of 1918 can be seen not as an anomalous and lamentable backsliding to painting from the unalloyed radicality of the ready-mades, but rather as their unacknowledged endpoint or even telos. Yet on the issue or even leitmotif of gesture that runs throughout the catalog and that I was asked specifically to comment on, I find myself with questions. I was surprised to find recourse to not, say, Rosalind Krauss's notion of materialized color, but rather on more than one occasion to Richard Schiff's discussions of the Impressionist and post-Impressionist touch. When this first occurred to me, I typed a note into my iPhone, which auto-corrected Richard Schiff to Richard Giff, which I thought was just a mistake, but which was probably the algorithm reading my notes from the catalog, my calendar, my flight itinerary to Munich, and helpfully filling in the basic premise of Painting 2.0 for me, which is the action, formerly aligned with action painting, is now allied with or displaced by graphics interchange format animations, i.e. GIFs. The mark of the hand inextricably tied to the simulative capacities of digital tech. However, the recourse to the actual Richard Schiff, rather than the fictional Richard Giff, points towards a different alliance, at times almost an axiomatic equivalence of gesture with expression. I found this surprising reading the catalog, and I find it even more surprising given the ground floor exhibition here, with works from Guy Debord's memoirs to Mike Kelly's banners to Martin Wong's jackets. Despite the attempt to problematize these terms via mediation, which is one of the exhibition's opening gambits, I find them to be, these terms, gesture and spectacle, to be conceptually almost inevitably opposed. not necessarily by the exhibition, but just in the terms in and of themselves, whether one is used to critique the other, as in gestural physicality guaranteeing a sense of presence against the spectacular expropriation of experience, or conversely, the spectacular colonization of visuality, disallowing any sense of physical experiential engagement, or whether the two terms are understood as in some new synthesis or even unsynthesized realignment. Where I might have gone in order to think the relation between the painter and the painting, the subject and the object, the mark and the field, the body and power, would have been the apparatus, which, although it may be obvious, didn't seem to have entered the catalog at all, despite a persistent emphasis on networks and network painting. Giorgio Agamben describes the apparatus as, quote, anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Not only, therefore, he continues, prisons, madhouses, the panopticon schools, etc., but also the pen, writing, literature, philosophy, agriculture, cigarettes, navigation, computers, cellular telephones, and why not, he says, language itself. While Agamben is keen here to assert his surpassing of Foucault, the bodily inscription of the apparatus, down to the level of cigarette or pen, was clearly outlined in Discipline and Punish, which described the trace left in the, quote, in the form of habits and behavior, end quote, by techniques that ensnare individuals within various apparati. The trace, then, is both the mark of the body and the mark within the body of the apparatus or apparati in which it is trained, the apparatus by and within which an individual becomes a subject, which is nothing other than being subjected, in all senses of the term, to the apparatus as power. In the theory of Bloom, Tikkun discussed the trace as, quote, the falseness in each of our gestures, that which betrays the presence of, quote, the other that is the economy within us. Against this, they juxtapose a true gesture, which would be an event. Although I've used Tikkun's notion of the gesture in a different context, I wouldn't go there now, because Tikkun's sometimes overheated rhetoric risks plunging us back into something like Harold Rosenberg-like existentialism. Instead, I would be tempted to look again to Agamben, whose The Author as Gesture, which is in dialogue with Tikkun, draws on Foucault's treatments of authorship and infamy to discuss the role of the gesture within the apparatus of writing. For Agamben, the gesture is where the embodied subject comes into contact with the apparatus, functioning through it, but also pushing against and even transforming it, which is why the gesture is not simply the trace. Yet in so doing, the gesture does not point to any outside. It is not opposed to or free of the apparatus. It doesn't point back to the author as a locus of intentionality, plenitude, meaning, or expression. Trace, gesture, meaning, signification, expression, these are not elements that one puts into an apparatus, but that very precisely arise from as a function of the encounter with the apparatus itself. Quotes here are somewhat unhelpful, but I'm going to give you one anyway. The subject, like the author, writes Agamben, is not something that can be directly attained as a substantial reality present in some place. On the contrary, it is what results from the encounter and from the hand-to-hand confrontation with the apparatus in which it has been put and has put itself into play. And just as the author must remain unexpressed in the work while still attesting in precisely this way to his own irreducible presence, a subjectivity is produced where the living being, encountering language and putting itself into play in language without reserve, exhibits in a gesture the impossibility of being reduced to this gesture. If we look at the discourse of painting as an apparatus, which I think this exhibition invites us to do, something similar, something like the unexpressive gesture that also refuses being reduced to a gesture, seems to be the condition of much that we see in these galleries, or at least on the floor that I was supposed to look at. If the discourse on viable painting today has largely been approached in one of four ways, as network painting, as the type of camp appropriation described by Amy Silman, as a mode of being, as in Mikhail Kreber's Invocation of the Dandy, or as a revelation of or comment on contemporary visual techniques or regimes, as in Wade Goyton, Kelly Walker, or Jacqueline Humphreys, All four might seem to be unified by their engagement with this type of unexpressive, perhaps operational notion of a gesture in the apparatus. I think the implications here for rethinking spectacle are clear, and we can leave that to the discussion. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm just going to really pick up where you stopped, because I'm talking about the exact same thing, about subject and being subjected and the problem of that. So it's going to be a bit more tentative, but as I'm talking about the top floor. And I will also obviously then not do an instant critique of the show, but rather try to think through it or with it and see where I get to. And I'll be using dramatization as a model to think about this show, or to think about the lives of painting and also our lives via painting. Because this lifelike character of painting is what sort of struck me very much when seeing the exhibition yesterday and today, specifically in eccentric figuration, but then again, not only in eccentric figuration. And I mean lifelike, not in the sense of naturalism, or well, maybe if it's a naturalism in which nature is a somewhat crooked contagion, and lifelike not in the sense of realism, unless if one understands the real as a constant lack. And lastly, lifelike also not as the fiction of an immediacy of subjective expression, unless of course one sees the subject form for what it is to us humans today, a nostalgic and dysfunctional heritage of a failed emancipation. So, lifelike in the sense that painting is just as wrong and as compromised and as ridiculous as are its producers and its beholders, but also as beautiful, as sexed, as endearing. And in that sense, one of the things this show does for me is claiming a different form of medium specificity. Not one which reclaims modernist formalism, obviously, hopefully, or simply updates it in mimicking capitalism's newer means of production, but rather one in which this formalism is debordered and see this power over the life that is bordering on it. Because it is not only painting's form that became questionable, but also human life's form, the bourgeois subject, whose realization arguably was no longer postponed, but broke apart. And this is something which I find interesting to discuss in how very different the three parts of the exhibition are in that respect, or at least it's something I'm interested in. And in eccentric figuration, this reminded me of what Peter Gorsen once called a subjectless realism, one that is decidedly hedonistic, but that retrieves hedonism even in its most defaced forms, a painterly rejection of future-bound utopias of realization, and their replacement with present-day defective pleasures, defective forms and defective humans. And in that sense, in the sense of a debordering formalism, all three accounts are dramatizations of what painting became after 1916. Dramatizations not because the paintings are so dramatic, some might be, but that's besides the point. But more fundamentally, what is demonstrated is what once was introduced to us as representation was in fact just covering up intensities, dysfunctionalities, and a fundamental lack of integrity. And in what I called lifelike quality of painting in this show, in the beginning, painting's lack of integrity is no longer covered up, but exposed and formally built up. It becomes painting's medium specificity, its personality, exactly because of its being the perfect commodity, because of its being the poster boy of a subjective hubris. So painting as a formalism of lived reality, as a dramatized and sometimes subjectless individuation. And that is specifically true, obviously, or I don't know, I would say obviously, for eccentric abstraction. And this makes painting become legible in a very different way. Eccentric figuration lays out the panorama of an unrequited love for the ideal of the modern subject, of which the artist, but even more so the painter, has always been a prototype. Unrequited because this painting does not try to mimic this prototype or simulate it or represent it any longer, but turns it into a series of lived approximations, rejections, and dramatizations. If you look, for instance, at Lee Lozano's or Eva Hesse's 1960s paintings in that respect, they're fantastically beautiful and touching because they very aggressively and formally, very consequentially, do not propose themselves as the painterly female exceptions of the male painterly rule of the time. They do not gender themselves, but they sex painting. So it's luxurious to be the one on this panel who was asked to focus on eccentric figuration, because such a sexed life of painting here develops a very aggressive presence. And I mean the sexed life of painting. I don't mean queer, I don't mean feminist, I don't mean feeding into a better representation for anyone, but rather a taking up of representation itself as a crooked naturalism. And so works like Cy Twombly or Frank Stella up there become sort of sleazy and goofy, which makes them great, which makes them lifelike, which makes them geographically and temporally fixed again and saves them from their oeuvres for a short moment. And I'll also do the thing which one shouldn't do and quote, and I'm going to make it worse, I'm going to quote Hegel. But it's such a great text. It's the Jena Realphilosophie of 1806. It's like his first and shortest system. So if anyone wants to read Hegel but not really go into the big books, it's 90 pages and it's the whole system. I can only recommend it. And I'm using him because it's something very abstract, but that then unveils itself as something very concrete. And it's the passage where he talks about intelligence, which comes before the passage where he talks about the free will. So no free will here. So, and I quote, "It takes it, that is, the human, takes first itself as an object, that is, as an image. The image is unconscious. It is not displayed as an object for representation. And this is the night, the interior of human nature, which is existing here. In phantasmagoric representations, it is night everywhere. Here a bloody head suddenly shoots up, and there another white shape, only to disappear as suddenly. We see this night when we look a human being in the eye, for from his eyes the night of the world hangs out towards us." End quote. So, and if you stand, for example, in front of Michael Eisenman's Bloody Orifices, which Manuela Amas' beautiful catalog text starts from, or really in front of any Eisenman work in this show, this world which hangs out towards us from the eyes becomes very palpable. You could argue the same for Monika Bär's Vampire, or for Jutta Köter's work in the eccentric figuration part of the show. Also because Hegel's formulation of the world hanging out towards us is not exactly addressing us. So it's just hanging out, it's not communicating with us, it's just like, yeah, you got the picture. But quite on the opposite, it's threateningly disinterested in its beholder. An image not meant to address us as a form of representation, but a phantasmagoric dramatization that affects us, but that does not take the form of communication. It just confronts us. So here painting appears exceedingly unfaithful to its historical nobilitations, because it uses representation in the sense in which Hegel accounts for it here, as an internal drama which we are troubled with. So what we see is a medium specificity of lives of painting and in painting that is not expressing a subject or representing it, but rather giving presence to what this subject form amounts to if we regard not how well preserved its unity is or what its legibility might be as a bourgeois subject, but rather following up its sexed being exactly where it's not directed, where it's not reproductive, where it's not functional, but libidinal and thus sort of aggressive. So what eccentric figuration opens up for me within painting is a sense of dramatized formalism. A formalism that exceeds its inherited sense of medium specificity, not so much in claiming to be post-mediatic, but rather in very precisely debordering the medium and its formalism so that the lived life itself becomes a formal problem too. Instead of working on the dynamics of representation, what is termed eccentric figuration here, to my mind, works on the dynamics buried within representation. Thank you.
Thank you both, and thank you to Achim and David and Manuela, Antonio, and everyone at the Brandhorst for having us. I'll just start actually picking up also a few of the threads that we've been broaching. To me, the painting in this show is energized not by some consensus around a medium or genre or ontology. It's galvanized by a series of profound contradictions. And I'm going to invoke the curator Harry Cooper here, who has said very beautifully that contradictions were at the heart of abstract expressionism, the historical movement that looms large over this show and its exploration of expression, painting, gesture, and mediation. Literally, abstract is to pull away. Express is to push forth. Harry Cooper then enumerated numerous other contradictions, like the controlled accident. So when Pollock is dripping, he's leaving certain aspects of the mark to contingency, to chance, but he's also carefully calibrating those accidents as well. In the same way, the terms in this exhibition's subtitle, information and expression, might seem opposed: cold objective data versus subjective immediacy. So I'd like to propose 4 contradictions at the core of the work in the show, and specifically I saw in the section The Social Network on the bottom floor. So the first contradiction is the networked self, the individual self versus the network of many. The show explores painting's imbrication in social networks, but the phrase social network has several distinct meanings or implications here. First, there's the social network in the kind of loose sense as a group or a community. There's also the specifically technological sense of social media platforms today. And then there's also the sociological sense of the word network. And the network very specifically, and as I think David is invoking it in the catalog, comes from Bruno Latour, and Latour's network is meant to upset the traditional sociological binaries of structure and agency, of external social forces versus individual action and transformation, object and subject, inside and outside. So instead of objects or subjects, what's important are relationships. Everything is connected and everything is changing. What matters is the relative strength or weakness or proximity or distance of a connection at a given moment. We're confronted with the tensions between individual action and external social forces here, of inside and outside, perhaps even between apparatus and subject. Networks are predicated on connection, on relations, but of course they also produce isolation and alienation. They connect people, but they also mediate between them. They abstract and they replace physical interaction. And this is also the paradox of the exclusive network. As we see in that ground floor, the bottom floor, a network like Cologne is as much about exclusion as inclusion, dissensus as consensus, competition as much as cooperation. And this is something that we can perhaps talk about as well in terms of the mode of portraiture, which is also very much on view in that bottom floor. So someone like Warhol or Rebecca Quaitman or Jana Euler, the mode of address of those figures as belonging to very specific networks, that could be something that we could talk about more as well. Second contradiction is interrupted flow. We still think of painting largely as a discrete object, but painting has always traveled. Manuscript painting was portable, meant to be held. Paintings have been designed for transit via ship or train, and painting in these guises often addressed its own portability, its mobility, its transport, its status as a thing of weight, of texture, and of orientation, but also as a thing in motion, in transmission. And the painting par excellence of this might be Moholy-Nagy's telephone paintings of 1921, which he famously said he would just call up the fabricator and have them make the painting. But there's also then this movement and stillness, this kind of tension between the two, at the heart of painting's relationship to that other big network, the market. And already in the 1960s, the art historian Meyer Shapiro had worried about painting's predilection for reification, to be objectified, arrested as a commodity. It seems that painting 2.0 is concerned with this tension between movement and stasis as well. The movement of the gestural brushstroke, and David has called this passage, its objectification or congealment into a commodity, and the movement of painting or image itself through fields of attention and distraction. And what we see, and what struck me in this bottom floor, were really the proliferation and circulation of painting through various circuits, whether Warhol's factory or the Burgess furniture store or the AIR group and their various sites of display. So painting seems to be in a constant push and pull, a movement and a rest. And this, I think, points to the contradiction of the context of capital, that artworks become commodified not just as things, but as they circulate, as they speed up, their circulation and dislocation actually enhancing their value. And so the works on display here seem to be both about congealment and flow. And we see this in some of the fantastic icons of circuitry in Heimel Zobernig's paintings or Matt Mulliken. The third contradiction is the dematerialized thing. Painting that is both resolutely material, concrete, and immaterial. And so for me, what was very striking was the room with capitalist realist works. At that moment, capitalist realism really taking on industrial production. And at a moment when industrial production is really turning objects into flows, into streams of objects. So as industrial production takes the form of a complex of processes, like a net or a network, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the object's disappearance becomes a real paradox of mass production. The more technologically advanced the process of the object's production, the less corporeal, tangible, and object-like that object, in fact, becomes. In Laura Owens' work, which is not on my floor, but I'd like to invoke it anyway, I think you also see the manifestation of this contrast between materiality and immateriality turning into a very peculiar model of the picture, not as a mirror or as a window or even as a flatbed picture plane, but as a kind of pliant digital mesh where pictorial incident seems to oscillate between a real brushstroke, a printed registration, a hyperspace in which it's almost like that game of hands when you've got hands on top of one another and you keep moving the hands. So there's really no figure or ground, top, bottom layer. And this probably has something to do with the idea of painting already as a kind of screen. And the paradox today, perhaps, of paintings as material things made for virtual networks, paintings made for screens, paintings made to circulate on Instagram, to look good on Contemporary Art Daily, or on a scrolling interface. And this is, again, especially interesting at a moment when the image itself has become tactile, a screen to touch, to grab and move, an interface. At a time when languages and codes seem to define all areas of experience and understanding, what happens to painting, to the thing, the image, that cannot necessarily be assimilated into language or into informatic representation? Finally, number 4, infinite scale. Scale is crucial to the social network. Both platforms of social media, as well as what we call big data, are not just about, oh my God, there's so much data in the world now. It's really specifically about systems that get stronger, that get more powerful, the more data they incorporate. And this is specific to certain platforms that we know today, such as Facebook, Instagram, etc. Google, for example, operates on the strength and the length of links. Some painting seems to want to represent or be part of or manifest or contend with this kind of scale. How can the singularity of painting capture or contend with multiplicity? How can physical painting coincide with this massive expansion? Now, painting has always attempted, in many ways, to represent the infinite. Think of Correggio's domes of clouds, for example. But in the guise of this section of the exhibition today, we see several strategies employed by, for example, the capitalist realists using multiples. And not so much what's on view here, but as invoked by René Bloch, who was working with the serial output of the capitalist realists, the generation of multiples, or the production of multiples, was really intended at a much larger scale, much larger than, let's say, Fluxus had intended or accomplished. And then in Warhol's massive proliferating series, in silkscreens, reproductions, in even of people, we see these strategies of some attempt to broach an expanded scale. But perhaps the most prescient for me is another work that's not on view, but that is also by Warhol. And it's a work that was called Silver Clouds of 1966. And these were a series of essentially silver monochromes, rectangular silver monochromes, blown up and inflated into an open-ended series of mylar balloons. This series, unlike Warhol's other series, was never numbered. They floated out the window, and in fact, there was a test balloon that he referred to as a kind of satellite. The material itself that he used, which actually is a type of mylar, was also, in fact, of the same family of material that was used to create the first telecommunications satellite, Echo 1, which was likewise an inflatable reflective balloon. This, to me, was an incredible example of an artist thinking about painting, thinking about scale, and fundamentally achieving a kind of dissemination or proliferation of the image. Thinking about a kind of picture that would not merely reflect or illustrate networks, but that might distort or exaggerate them, or even speculate about new systems, posing experiences and relationships that we do not yet know. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you. This is I can speak only for myself, but I assume for my collaborators as well, incredibly gratifying to have these extremely intelligent and thoughtful responses to our exhibition. It really is a great privilege to have the three of you commenting on this occasion, and I really appreciate it. I want to start with a question, or perhaps a weaving together of some of the themes in each of the three talks, terrific talks, around the question of what Brandon called, I think quite precisely, the paradox of post-painterly practices becoming addressable by the discourse of painting. Because I think that there is something, I suppose, paradoxical about this exhibition, which is trying to retain painting and yet lose the medium specificity of painting. So what is left when you do that? And Brandon articulated the problem that way. I think, Kerstin, when your proposal of life or the lifelike or the dramatization seemed to me to be in place of medium on some level in a very interesting way, in a way that actually I'm looking forward to thinking about more, as a kind of agency or practice that need not form itself into a structure that is a medium. And then, Michelle, I'm really struck by the notion of contradiction, which, I suppose one can think of a medium as the persistence of a discourse, right? So on some level, contradiction would seem to be a threat to it in terms of breaking it apart, and yet it doesn't seem to break this medium, or at least, you know, our exhibition is an attempt to show that it's resilient enough to reabsorb these contradictions. I don't know if you'd each like to make a remark about, you know, the paradox of retaining painting, really, as a kind of discursive framework for such a project. Whoever wants to start. You can go in.
Going in order?
Why not? We seem to like the three in this.
Well, I mean, to respond to that, you know, David, you and I have somewhat the same art historical formation, right? So, and, you know, we were taught, and we've probably taught others, this story of painting being surpassed in the 1960s by various different things. I mean, interestingly for me, this is in some ways the second time that an art historical discourse has reached out to engage with things that I thought were not the same thing. And so, and I was saying this to Michelle before, there was a certain time in my life when I thought all of this stuff that I liked in music was art, and then I went to school and found out that it wasn't art, right? And then more recently, things like Throbbing Gristle are art again, right? So that I've had to sort of go back and sort of read, you know, sort of jigger what I was told. And here, you know, it's not exactly the same thing, but it is interesting to have these discursive reformations, not simply deformations or transformations, but reformations. And one of the things that I thought about as in engaging with, or seeing this show, but also with seeing the exhibition that Manuela and Ulrike Muller did in the MUMOC, which is up now, and also in some of the thoughts that I had around Greater New York, the Greater New York, especially one room in Greater New York at PS1 that's devoted to sculpture, is that one of the things that seems to be happening, it's happening in my own work, it's happening in the work of my students, is that we're moving from thinking always of the 60s as our point of going back to, and the 70s are really coming up as the point of reference. And I think that stylistically and discursively and things. And one of the things that's interesting to me in relation to what I just laid out, right, is that, of course, Warhol retires from painting, and that to me has always been very important because it valorized to me some of the things that I thought was very important about his work, such as engaging with the Velvet Underground and the cinema and all these things that, at least when I was, you know, in the late 80s, were not valorized, say by the Museum of Modern Art, that valorized him as a painter, right? In some ways, same thing with Rauschenberg. But both Warhol and Rauschenberg go back in the 70s to a form of something that's discursively identifiable as painting. So in Warhol's case, it's the Mao silk screens with the brush strokes on them. And in Rauschenberg's case, it's a maybe even more expanded painting field that has a lot to do in the 70s with designating fields of cloth as basically, treating fields of cloth as monochromes. So in some ways, the story that we valorized years ago of these artists of say, minimalism defeating painting, right, which was a gendered discussion that we had that wrote out a lot of people, of course, as all stories do. If you go to the 70s, which then that is changed, right? And it's somewhat the same, you know, I can't remember if it's your essay or someone else's essay in the catalog, but the discussion, I assume it's yours because it's Duchamp, but it may be not, of Duchamp's Tomb, the painting that incorporates ready-mades, which is done, I think, in 1918, which has always been seen as a sort of backsliding from the radicality of the unassisted ready-mades of 1917, and sort of written away. Well, it was Catherine Dreyer that it was a commission, so he did it for money. Like, I mean, all these things are actually written in as you know, well, in the literature around this piece. It's to sort of, you know, it's the same sort of move, right? You can sort of move to say, well, Warhol, yeah, he gave up painting, but then he re-engaged with painting, and to take that as as part of the origin of our discourse, to look at that as an origin point and not as a moment of decadence, right? Like you look at Warhol till 68 and he was shot, and then after that it doesn't really matter. So I think that historically, that to me is one of the things that this exhibition and a couple other exhibitions have done, is to sort of think really seriously about what is the discourse in the 70s, what types of voices are becoming legible in the 70s around what types of practices. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Kerstin, do you want
Yeah, maybe looking at something related from a different point of view, because I think why I'm still interested, again, interested in the question of medium specificity, and it's like disappearance or not disappearance or return, and is that I think one of the things painting for me is very paradigmatic for is in a way that Hegel failed, because there is no sublation. Nothing is ever sublated. The idea that history proceeds and things are sublated and then it moves on is just, well, history didn't really work out that way, for good and for bad. But so because that is the case, and because at the moment I would argue that we are still but more and more in a time of crisis, not only economically but very, very obviously politically. Temporality changes, though there's not only no sublation, so no progress, but also because there is no progress but catastrophe in a way, different times keep shooting up. And I think this is really what I'm also really interested in what you were saying about the points of origin and what you said about contradiction, that the points of origin are changing because they are returning in a different form of guise. I mean, like, modernism returns as a form of mannerism, because it's not gone and it's not sublated and it's not overcome, but its subject and the idea of subjectivity and the idea of authorship is sort of refiguring, I would argue, in the present, because as I think is very interesting in the ground floor and in Achim's essay in the catalogue, there is no alternative. So there is not really a post-medium specific subject to start with, and that's what I think is really great, or what I find it really interesting also about the three parts of the exhibition, that they all pose the question of what is agency and how can a medium like painting, which has always been so strongly connected to the question of agency, be reiterated today and reiterate its own history, and the answers of how authorship works and how it works in the painting but also in the beholder is very different in the three parts. And I think, I mean, what I was interested in looking at the upstairs part, but which is also interesting in the other, specifically thinking of what Michelle said about circulation, is then the question of libido, of like, so if you have, so how does the subject sex itself, and what is the corporeal representation in portraiture, but also in the authorship of painting, if you have a libido that is also not future-bound and also not progressing, but stumbling within the present, and so falling into different times. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Sure, I mean, I think the first thing that might be the most obvious is that I think one of the most compelling narratives of painting in the 20th century that many of us have been schooled in is that the myth of the individual bourgeois subject is to be defeated. That is something that is to be combated in many different ways and with many different strategies. And what I think is so striking about this show is that it's seeking to reintroduce some kind of subjectivity back into the equation, but in which ways and whether or not that is always successful, that's something that I think we can really debate probably. The other question is really, I guess, the question of conventions, and if we define a medium by its conventions still, then how do we understand basically new materials, new processes, and new ways of defining what those conventions are? I feel that much of this show is actually, one could be polemical and say that it's not actually a painting show in the end. So that would be, the other point of discussion, I guess.
I wouldn't mind, and again, this is just my point of view, I'm not speaking for the others, but I think it is a kind of painting show that is painting as an apparatus, that is, to use Brandon's term, or a device, as opposed to anything else. That in fact, maybe it persists only as a discourse. But anyway, I'm glad that question emerges, and whether one's answer falls here or there on it. I'm glad that the question emerges in the show. I think it was purposely one that we wanted to provoke. Let me ask just two more questions before opening to the audience. The first is, Kerstin, I'm very struck by and interested in hearing further about the model you propose of sexing without gendering. And I wonder if you could just say a few more words about how you're seeing that process working, either with regard to the paintings or in general.
I think the reason why I stress this so much, specifically in relation to the eccentric figuration, is because I would want to argue that it's something which is, because of the conventions which were just spoken about, something which is very central to painting as a contemporary form of practice, specifically today, because the conventions which in the 50s and 60s were much more harder, specifically on women who didn't just want to figure as women painters, have in a way changed today. I mean, this whole problem still persists, and it's still in discussion, and it's still in practice. One just has to look at the art academies to find the answer for that. But then again, those conventions can also, and you see that in the work of people like Jana Euler, but also Amy Silman, you can go through lots of the work and say these conventions are used against what their historical narrative was. And there is this Slovenian philosopher who's called Alenka Zupančič, and she made this really nice, great argument, I find, to say that sex is only sex where it's non-reproductive, which is a very simple thought, but if you think about the paintings as being sexed rather than gendered, then it's not so much about tying the painter or the paintings back to the reproductive function of its author or of its beholders, but rather thinking of a dysfunctional sex, thinking of a sex which has a really nicely aggressive note in it. So.
Do either of Brandon or Michelle want to take that up? Or I have another question that's more geared toward the two of you, actually, a joint question. That is, the question of painting's commodification is, as it were, a kind of huge elephant in the room. And one could say, in a way, that one of the goals of the show is to think painting outside of the market without excluding artists who behave well in the market, let's say, or who are successful in the market, because that seems also a mistake or an impossible position to take. And so I felt that you each addressed the question of commodification, but from quite different directions. I mean, Michelle, I think you talked about mobility and congealing, or mobility and stasis. I'm not sure stasis was the word. Fixity, some kind of opposite of mobility, and the moment of commodification then could be thought of as precisely that, as a moment, as opposed to a telos, as a kind of unsuccessful sublation, to use your term. But Brandon, you were, I think, more critical of our, no offense taken, but of our proposal that that gesture in some way, or the painterly act, the life of painting, could somehow invade spectacle or derail it. I mean, this is not the same as commodification, but obviously they're in the same ballpark. And so I think one of the arguments that that the show attempts to make is, in fact, that there is a way to undermine spectacle with the very means that spectacle, that the theorists of spectacle, such as Debord, condemned as completely impossible to use for that purpose, i.e. painting. So either take up on my prompts or not, but just if both of you could say a word, and Kerstin, if you want to join in too, then about this question of painting and commodification.
Oh, you want me to go? I mean, well, just in terms of if the criticality, if there was, is I'm smiling because I got an email a while back from Occam who said, I'm writing about Rauschenberg as an expressionist painter. What do you think about that? And I'm like, so that was sort of what was sort of behind my discussion of painting and expression. But you know, I think that. I think rather than answer that very, very large question, like a whole bunch of thoughts are coming, and maybe I'll just put them out there, right? So one is spectacle, right, which was my brief to talk about, which I didn't talk about. And actually, it was interesting when you were just talking about the sublation never happens, because my problem with the whole discourse of spectacle is sort of the equal opposite of that, which is that spectacle is a totalizing discourse, and totalization never happens, right? So the thing that I have a problem with the whole notion of spectacle and certain ways that the Frankfurt School is deployed is that we constantly hear the subject is now dead, we're totally in a completely commodified environment in which there's no outside. And then a couple years later, you know, Jameson will write a new book and he'll say, now everything's totalized and the subject is gone. And then a couple years later, we'll get, right? So I think that spectacle is both too partial, because in my reading of Debord, Debord is talking about a visual regime that has to do with the factory, that has a temporality of a factory of almost identical things that keep moving, that has a temporality of cinema in its traditional substrate, which is why I think that Debord is so good at fighting the spectacle, or chose to fight the spectacle in a type of anti-cinema, because he was going to the spectacle on its own place, right? So I've always thought that the notion of the spectacle is too totalizing, and I haven't really used it that much in my work, except to go in other places and to look at situations in power precisely in a differential manner, right? That there's different things sort of going on. And then in terms of commodification, I mean, I did think about commodification. I didn't really sort of speak about it. There's a couple things that come to mind about commodification, and one is when Michelle was talking about reification. I remember when I did an interview with Paolo Verno and sort of fed him a sort of Frankfurt School line about reification, and what he came back with was, no, reification is great. Like, reification is really good. Like, that's what we want as humans, is to put things out there in sort of reified form. And I don't know if reification is really the term that one should fear when it comes to painting so much as speculation. I think that speculation is a form of circulation that the painting, of network circulation that the painting can engage with, that other forms of artistic practice are not necessarily as good or as bad, depending on your point of view of doing. Right? So yes, performance can be paid and it can enter into a type of service economy or something, but there's a difference that's been shown, despite the commodification of things, in terms of how one can speculate on painting, or at least the degree to which one can speculate on painting. So I don't know, I mean, that's not really something I've fully thought out, but that's something that I'd put forward. And the last thing that I would say about the notion of commodification is something that, because I've always also, been, I mean, we have to deal with the contradictions of our time and of historical time in the engagement with cultural artifacts. A big one of those is the market. We can think about something like Andrea Fraser's essays that she did around the time of the biennial that she sort of was in and was not in, about how, as critics, it is our job to engage with and to look at the way that these objects are affected in the market. I mean, one of the things that painting, as a discourse says to me, in part, is that, you'll never be able to afford it, right? And a lot of people are in that situation, right? So that's, but I've always also thought about, painting and the relation of commodification, and I was intrigued to see it in Seth Price's so-called novel that it came out, is a relationship between painting and literature or the book. Because the book is a commodity. And even though a book doesn't cost that much as an individual object, you don't have the same stigma if you're the top of the New York Times bestseller list. That doesn't disqualify you from being literature necessarily, right? So, and so it was interesting to me that one of the things when Seth was considering whole bunches of aspects of contemporary practice, or pseudo-considering them, depending on whether you take it as an art treatise or a novel or both, or thinking around these objects, was thinking about a sort of relationship between the novel and experimental artistic practice. And I don't know where that would go, but I think it's interesting that it was put on the table recently by one of our protagonists in the galleries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
To respond to a few of the things that you invoked as well, I think the question of painting and commodification is really emblematic of one of the central contradictions of capitalism, right? Which is that we have the most abstract society that has ever existed. And it's a society that, on the other hand, produces and consumes ever more concrete physical stuff. So the commodity is really at its purest when it's at its most dematerialized. I mean, that's the paradox of calling something materialist, of calling capitalism materialist, when in fact it is really about dematerialization. And so in that sense, thinking about circulation too as amplifying or auguring commodification is, part of. It's become something that seems to be historically specific in becoming ever increasingly the case to describe artwork today. So that's the other aspect of circulation. I guess my other question is whether or not painting in the end is such a great commodity in and of itself. It actually seems like it's usually, compared to some other things, not a very good investment. Precisely so far as that it is highly speculative, but often that results in the negative rather than the positive. So I guess that would be something that I would open up as well.
I think it might be time. We have a big audience who I hope is full of people with questions. So let's open up to you and see what you'd like us to talk about.
Thank you very much. I have sort of a very convoluted question, mostly for Kerstin, which is that, what is the part of the show called again? Eccentric figuration. I guess I was wondering, one thing that's striking about this show is that it only comments on the geopolitical in very obtuse or obscure ways. And mostly, with very few exceptions, all of the artists are from the West and almost all of them are white. And I wondered, which is not to say that that should be the goal of the show, but it's just a comment on what's in the show. And I wondered, last night there was an episode of what one might call, in a vulgar way, extremely eccentric figuration in Paris, where the terms of the mediation are also smears, blood, color, visceral representations. And I wondered, I guess, how we might sort of read the geopolitical things that happen in these, what do you want to call it, like Tiger's Leap, if you consider Lepanto takes on a completely different tenor in light of recent events when you look at the Twombly paintings. And as a subject, the subject of Lepanto. So I wondered in what sense sort of the ideas of life and lived that you were talking about intersect with these kinds of events, and to what extent they then maybe, if we think about Hegel, are sort of trapped in that contradiction of being universal and yet highly particular at the same time. Or I wondered if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that, those issues.
I mean, firstly, I would say there is a big difference between universalism and holism. And I think today, like if one thinks about the historical becoming problematic of the subject form, but also anti-Oedipus not really taking on at the same time too, and what concretion that bears and how very contradictive and aggressive. I mean, it's such a big difference to say you had up until the end of the 80s a systems confrontation where political systems were battling over who is the most emancipated. And today you don't have that battle. You have a battle which is far beyond emancipation, and in which emancipation isn't invoked on any of the sides, but it's mutual eradication. I would not myself ever discuss those attempts of mutual eradication in artistic terms, because I would say that to think about art and to think about the subject forms or the deviations of the subject forms artistic production and reception can entail is a luxury problem, one which I find very relevant socially. And because of art being, autonomous art being this bourgeois invention, which doesn't exist for that long and which is totally dysfunctional. So let's make the most out of being dysfunctional. But I don't think one can turn this into like a social functionalism in and of itself in a moment where the sheer brutality of what politically happens. I mean, also in terms of look at what's happening to the discussion around migration in Germany. That's not much nicer. And I don't think that like there is a direct relation of painting to this or to that, but of the bourgeois subject and of the failure of the bourgeois subject, but the alternativeness of the bourgeois subject, sure, there is. But
any more questions?
There's one here.
It's not so much a question as a further elaboration of you dragging Duchamp's tomb into the discussion, because that's in 1918, and I don't really have the date, but much later than that, Duchamp makes etchings of ready-mades. I mean, I remember seeing an etching of a urinal. And that has stuck with me because it seems as if even overleaping the point he was making with tomb, and in a very efficacious manner, he folded in his own historicity as a process in making this very modest scaled lithograph, etching of a urinal, and making reference to his work. And so, and this is far after the valise also. And I'm just wondering if that could contribute to the discussion at hand in the show also, because Duchamp, has proven to be a marker repeatedly and successively in more and more extended fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, of course. And I think that not only, I think, well, just to sort of go back and to pick up what you're saying in relation to what I'd said before, I think one of the things I was saying before about, we valorize this moment of Warhol and Rauschenberg leave, or I did, let's say I did, but at least some other people did, of leaving the painting. And it occurred to me in thinking about it that at the time they were working, there was a similar valorization of the idea that Duchamp had given up making art, right? And so the famous silence of Duchamp, and that he had given up making art, when of course he never gave up making art, right? And so we now would think it's very naive to think that he had done the ready-made and that was the end, because there are all of these interesting things, not just the etchings, but the remakings the ready-mades and the extended dialogue that in fact, and this has not really been, because Duchamp is still seen as an origin point, but the extended dialogue that he had with, say, Rauschenberg and Johns. I mean, if you go back and look at the dates of some of Duchamp's most famous statements about, say, color as a ready-made, they actually come after Rauschenberg said color was a ready-made, right? So this is an extended dialogue that's going along at this time. And so when I was thinking about and I understand why curatorially it wouldn't have worked in this exhibition, but you could have imagined not showing Rauschenberg's from the 60s and not showing Warhol's from the 60s, but showing them from the 70s. And it wouldn't have had the same polemical import that I think the curators wanted to have to do that. But it does make me, think about now that we're going back again generationally to look at that period of looking at a wider selection of these artists' oeuvre as being important, right? And I think that, well, I'll stop there.
There seems to me a strange disconnect between what we were all talking about here and the actual vibe of the exhibition, which seems to have a celebratory aspect of actually looking at painting and idiosyncratic strategies of dealing with paintings through the years and giving voice to positions that we haven't seen before, putting them together, linking things, doing actually a live, in my opinion, very beautiful act of giving us possibility. I'm disappearing here. But what I want to say is, from the discussion, I get this idea that you are actually negating this idea of the subject, the painter, as the one who has the right to have a strategy and to intention and produce.
Is that you, singular or plural? You're looking at me, I take it. Is a singular you?
You were especially, actually it's plural, because it's not, again, I was absolutely amazed by your introduction. This is not a critique of any sort. It's just that I have the feeling by now, the disconnect between what we're talking about and what we're seeing is a little bit too too far away.
I can see your reaction, although it's not exactly what I was attempting to do, because I was attempting, in a way, to give a way that I would have approached the question of gesture that allows gesture to still exist without recourse to a notion of expression that I think is maybe too simple. Yeah. And so, so if we go back to the little small Agamben essay that I chose to look at to think about my comments. So just let me get one thing and then you can go, right? Which is that his example is writing, right? And what his point is about the gesture, right, is not, he makes this point about, he looks at a poem and he says, about this poem, there's this poem that is about an expression of a feeling, I forget exactly the feeling of love. Did the poet have a feeling of love and then write the poem? Probably not. Probably in the midst of trying to write a poem, he had something like a feeling that got encapsulated in the poem that wouldn't have come to him if he had not been writing the poem, and of course wouldn't have existed in the poem if he had not been writing it. So what Agamben is trying to do is actually quite affirmative, which is to reclaim a notion of gesture, but to say a notion of gesture which doesn't need to rely on a notion of a subject that we maybe don't necessarily believe in anymore. So what he's trying to do is precisely reclaim a notion of authorship from Foucault's notion of the death of the author, or in other words, to understand what it is when Foucault says the author writes, but the author always writes as a dead man. And what does that mean? Because the person writing as a dead man is not dead, right? And so, and I mean, I'm a gloomy guy, so it probably came out gloomy, which is probably fine. But that wasn't actually the intention, and it's not the intention. I think if you go to author as gesture, what you will find is that you will find this notion really of the gesture very much, as Agamben says, the gesture is that which is produced by and in the apparatus, but which is not exactly the apparatus. So that's that quote that I tried to read, which
Right.
again is insufficient, which is the gesture that cannot be reduced to a gesture. Right. So, I think that's in evidence in lots of different ways. Here.
Absolutely, you're completely right there. I do think so that you are presenting it in a reductionist way. You know, like as a painter, I can only obviously speak as a painter, and you know, like. To actually create a work, it is exactly more than like a projection or the history of a projection, or like it is especially not a direct gesture. It is also fucking work. Like it goes through a whole kind of really often contradictional, paradoxical notions of what you can do, what you can't do, where you can do it, what you want with it. Like it's not as easy. Like I have the feeling that you're putting things against each other. That don't work like that. That's what I like in the exhibition. Yeah. That you actually get that. Like that there are all those notions through the years. Like that people coming to conclusions at different times. You insist now, okay, the 70s are important, the 60s are not important anymore. And I think to us, I'm obviously now reducing your comment as well, but that's what I'm hearing out of the whole thing. So for us now to work, or for anybody to work, it's much more than that. Like you're a thinker, you're thinking about those things. To make something, you have to jump over those things. And I think the exhibition is a beautiful example of people who have jumped at different times in different forms and done it with the medium of painting.
Yeah, I think you and I are not that far apart, actually. So, and I'm just going to go back to one of the things that I said at the beginning. Is I said there were two reasons why my comments would be inevitably disappointing. The first was that I'm not an expert in painting, and the second was that I was responding to some things in the catalog that people haven't read. And I think that in some ways, you're doubly disappointed in somewhat the ways that I predicted, I think, is somewhat what's going on. But I don't think we're actually that far apart in terms of how we conceive of artistic labor, although when you just said that you can only speak as a painter and I can only speak as a non-painter, so that would be what I would sort of say to that.
I have a question. Excuse me. I got the notion in between that painting was referred to as a symptom of the failure within the concept of progress. And if that were the case, painting would be a form of regression. And if that were the case, this show would be of no relevance, I find. So my question to the curators would be, is this the case? Do you see this in this way? And I would defend painting as a possible field of discourse, which includes not having to use hygiene as the companion of ideas of progress. So that's my question. Do you see painting as a regression, as a symptom of the failure of progress? And if so, I would be against that.
I think what you're, is this on? Yeah. Yes. I think what you're picking up on, if I'm remembering correctly, is a remark that Kerstin made about, not about, well, about progress, but as I read it, about a model of history that thinks teleologically, as though there is one, there is a kind of stepped form of progress that one can mark. And I do think, actually, that the exhibition is against that idea, because but for the idea of a kind of history that's really particular, that I like what Charlene just said, of jumps at different times. I think that, in a way, is that could be the title, maybe, jumps at different times of the show. Because I actually don't think there's a real contradiction here, because I think that a model of history that sees, as Brandon was saying, painting dies, then conceptual art comes, then painting rises again and it's a function of the market, in the 80s, and et cetera. That is the kind of progressive history that we precisely don't want. Instead, I think what we want is a kind of history that shows the sort of discursive transformations of a medium on many different grounds over a period of time. And that, to go back to this kind of question of speaking as a painter or speaking as a historian, I'm not a curator, but, I had a curatorial role in this project along with others, and it's very interesting to me, actually, to be able to, as it were, think with the objects in a different way. Like, it feels, in having to produce discourse, I actually think everything that's said tonight is incredibly inspiring and actually super exciting for me to hear these serious responses. But also in opening the show and having to kind of give, deliver it in discourse, it's been very interesting and frustrating because I feel like the show is itself, it doesn't almost need to be talked about. Like, it is there. The talking about it, it has another use value, but the show is its own. It doesn't need anything else, it seems to me, in a certain way. And I don't mean that. That might seem very inhospitable, but I feel like the discourse here is about bringing it to a different plane, you know what I mean? Putting it in a different position. But the exhibition itself can't be summarized. And I think what I appreciate about what everyone's here said was that they didn't try to summarize the exhibition. Instead, they drew from it as a resource to make a certain set of arguments.
Can I just shortly, because I would also say, like, it's not I wouldn't want to make the opposition of progression and regression. I don't think that the alternative to criticizing progress means regress, but more that in a way, and I think for this the show is really fantastic because in a way what it also does is what I try to point to with referring to Peter Gorsen is that time and space become qualitative again, because if you have like a modernist idea of progress, then time and space are just variables which you fill with whatever comes at hand. And I think painting is very much, and this show is very good in demonstrating this, showing the significance of a qualitative understanding of time and space, so of a lived time. And so I would say, yes, progress is really in trouble, but that for good and for bad has the situation of a qualitative lived time, which is super painful and super brutal, but it's also very enjoyable and very hedonistic. So, and I think in this, I mean, the show doesn't really, for me, it doesn't go by showing great works, even though there are great works in it, but by the significance which they have in relation to one another. And I think this is also what was very strong in like all of the, like what we all picked up on in different ways. So,
my problem wasn't the concept of progress failing and holding on to some idea of progress. That wasn't the point. The point was, could it be that the interest in painting has to do with resignation, of not having this option anymore of utopias and so on, I'm sorry. But if that were the case, I would go against that. It's a very conservative idea of painting that one could fall back into, and I just wanted to warn in case this were happening.
Well, I think one of the whole points of the show was to demonstrate that a kind of determinist end point, as you're invoking, is not the case.
I never saw it. That's why I was surprised.
Right.
But I don't think anyone here said that
Yeah.
it was the case, actually. So I'm also surprised.
We're all surprised.
Because that was exactly what. I think also that I'm sorry.
No. Just to underscore one of the things that I found so visually striking about the show was that what you see is, instead of one sort of trajectory, a kind of set of formal problems that then have one solution that leads to the next problem that leads to another solution. Instead of that, you have a series of bifurcating paths and forking branches that might lead and jump unexpectedly to other kinds of works and other kinds of chronological points in time. And that's what I found so striking about the show.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that are striking about the show that are probably completely intentional, certainly I would think, right? No, I'm just saying that because I know that it's a collaborative process rather than just one person coming in with an intention. But, the 3 floors have different characters, right? And within the floors, there are different characters. So the show intentionally does not have one argument, I would think. That's what I would sort of think. The show doesn't have one argument. Even each floor doesn't seem to have one argument. Yet, and that's not a criticism, that's part of the enjoyment of the show. But at the same time, the show as a whole is making an argument, right? So the show will, as all shows do, but I think in this case it's particularly overt. The show has an experiential quality, obviously, but it has a full experiential engagement that one does with the works individually. It's great to see this work, great to see this floor, great to see all these things. But it's also intended to be an exhibition that puts forward a certain argument that travels even to people who don't see the show, right? So through the catalog, which is, the catalog is somewhat the same. The catalog has 3 major essays, one for each of the main sections, the Smithsonian floors, then has some other major essays, then it has a series of smaller essays. Like when you read the catalog, it's almost like essays, responses, and then you sort of have your own response. So I think that the show is extremely multiple, and it does lots of different things. I don't think it has one argument, but I think it does mean to circulate as a proposition, as a contention about painting in the 21st century, that calls for responses, and that has a type of, I don't want to say argumentative character, because it doesn't have a really argumentative character, and it doesn't even have, I'm grasping for the word, it doesn't even have one thesis, right? It's all about having multiple things, but it does have arguments and it has theses. And they're very clear. And I think that that's one of the things that, as not just as a historian coming to the show, but as someone who's come to the show that will inevitably discuss the show to people who haven't seen the show, that's one of the things that really comes out of that, right? I mean, sorry, that's what some of us art historians do, is we talk about things people haven't seen. But.
Maybe one more question, one or two.
I hope I'm not totally wrong about that, Dave.
Hello. I'm searching for mystical and mysticism in art. I would like that you give me some guidance for this show. I didn't have seen the pictures yet. I only see this one picture on the front with this man and his smartphone sitting in the cafe. As you mentioned at the beginning, yes, there are text messages in the smartphone and they correct themselves. That's a kind of mystical thing. That's, of course, it's technology, but for the user, it's wow, a kind of wizard, a kind of magic. Or social networks, I get friend requests, I get popping up from people I really know, and this is also a kind of mystic. Are there pictures or installations or some art that represents mysticism of this technology in this exhibition? Yeah, like imagine the work of Caspar David Friedrich. He paints art, he paints nature and people, but he paints them in a very mystical way. So you are dazzled about the mystic of nature. And I think this technology, social networks, and so on, would be a great playground to make pictures that are, in a way, mystifying these technologies.
I think that one of the characteristics of the exhibition is that I don't know, now it's on, okay, is that very material situations, very material networks, are shown to have other dimensions. I wouldn't say that they're mystical. I don't know that this is a very mystical presentation. But I think to go back to what Monica said a moment ago, I think there might be a utopian dimension to many of the practices. So if you call that mystical, then it comes in through the front door, perhaps. So maybe one more question, and then we'll call it an evening. Is there one more? No? Nobody? Yes, one more. Okay.
I have a very basic question, and I was just wondering about what that exhibition, what it claims to be. I mean, you said that it can be interpreted in various ways because the artworks are that different from each other, but still you made choices, and to me the title seems to have a very it seems to present the art of the 20th and the 21st century. So, but still, it's more or less focusing on artists from the Western world. And I was wondering whether you find this problematic too, because this is kind of excluding other kind of like streams or ways that art developed in other parts of the world. Do you get what my question?
Yes. We very carefully discussed this issue of whether the exhibition should embrace a sort of global argument or not. And in fact, we decided for a number of reasons that it would not. And the reason for that is we felt that the kind of multifarious narratives that are running through the exhibition circle around or gather around the US and Germany. They're not exclusively. And we really asked ourselves, why is that? And we came up with the notion that, in fact, both of these places had a long tradition of expressionist or gestural abstraction that in the post-war period met with what is known sometimes as an economic miracle. Therefore, introducing a kind of discourse of hyper-commodification into a discourse of expressive gesturalism. And we felt that there was a kind of logic to that as a large historical framework. It's not something that we explicitly foreground in the exhibition, but it is a kind of implicit structure. I think personally, and again, I can't speak for all of my collaborators, but I think perhaps they might agree with me that we felt that it was much better to give what we feel is a deep and multivalent history of a specific cultural axis, the Euro-American axis, than it was to introduce a kind of superficial form of diversity that wasn't deeply researched and which we could not really practically deeply research. So in this case, we make no apologies, I think, for this being a project about Western art, with the absolute acknowledgement that this is only one, discourse, and not even, I think, in a way, by introducing multiple narratives within this hegemonic, what is often considered a hegemonic narrative of Euro-American art history, is a way of saying, this isn't a univocal tradition, and therefore it cannot be thought of as that both outside the West and within it. So I think with that, we're getting to the point where our time is up, and I want to just really, really thank the three of you for taking on this rather difficult assignment of responding in real time to a very large show that you've only just seen a couple of days ago or yesterday. And I think in some cases, all three of your talks were incredibly inspiring and very meaningful for us, I think, to have this kind of response at this level. So I thank you very warmly, and I've been cut off. I guess that was too long a speech, but thank you all, and thank you all for coming.